Society for Transparency, Openness and Replication in Kinesiology. James is also a member of the American College of Sports Medicine and the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences, and is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. James, welcome back to the podcast.
It's great to be back, Brian. It feels like it's been a long time.
It does feel like it's been a long time, far too long actually. So great to have you back. I started to dig into today's topic and learn about research from yourself. So where should we start on this one? So efficacy versus effectiveness. So do you want to, I guess, start out by talking maybe about the genesis, about this idea, and then how it developed and some of the research around it?
Sure, yeah. So as some of the listeners might be aware, a couple of years back I took a slight turn in terms of the research that I was doing. So I'm still working in and around resistance training specifically with colleagues like Dr. James Fisher. But I started working with the UK Active Research Institute and looking at physical activity and exercise more generally, more on the kind of public health end of the spectrum. So looking at that kind of more population health approach. And but it was actually slightly before that, and something that led me towards that was coming across a paper which was written by the UK Active Research Institute Scientific Advisory Board back in 2015 or 2016, I have to get off the top of my head now, which was called Death by Effectiveness, Exercise as Medicine Caught in the Efficacy Trap. And I remember coming across it at the time because I was becoming more and more interested in how we can take some of the things that we've been learning from our studies of resistance training and how to manipulate resistance training interventions to optimize outcomes such as strength. The more and more I was realizing that these interventions could be quite simple, I was asking myself questions like, okay, well, how do we actually get people to do it? And so I wasn't aware of the terminology at the time until I came across this paper, but it talks about this idea of differentiating between what is called efficacy and what is called effectiveness. And so to define those terms, I guess, for the listeners, when we talk about efficacy when it comes to interventions, whether that's exercise or a drug therapy or any kind of intervention, what we're talking about is whether or not the intervention has an effect on the outcome that we're interested in when it is delivered under ideal conditions. So an example of that would be in an exercise intervention, we might have a very tightly controlled protocol that we use. We would invite people into the lab or a very tightly controlled environment, and we would make sure that they did the protocol exactly as it was designed to be delivered. And we would make sure it has extremely high fidelity, and we then observe whether or not it produces the outcomes that we're interested in. So this would be similar to what are called phase 1, 2, 3 trials in drug development. So it's trying to understand whether the drug itself, based on its pharmacokinetics and when people actually take it in the right doses, does it produce a desired outcome. But that's very different from asking the question of, if I recommend or prescribe this intervention, this exercise protocol, or this drug, does it produce the effects that I'm interested in? Because in that question, we're then taking away some of the control over the delivery of that intervention. So we might lose some of the fidelity of that intervention, and that might have an impact then on the effectiveness of it. So in the exercise example, a intervention that's been shown to be highly efficacious in controlled conditions won't necessarily produce the same magnitude of results when we then go to try and apply it in the real world, because we might have issues of adherence, people might not put in a sufficient intensity of effort, they might deviate from the protocol in slight ways that impact its effectiveness. The same with a drug treatment. So whether someone takes a drug is a different question, or the effect that a drug has when someone takes it is a different question to what effect the drug has when a doctor prescribes it, because people may or may not take the drug, they may not follow the exact dosing protocols, etc. So it was a real eye-opener to me to come across this this kind of area, or these two concepts, this differentiation between efficacy and effectiveness, and it got me thinking a lot more about what do we really understand about exercise generally, physical activity generally, and with respect to how effective it actually is for improving health, well-being, longevity, etc. Are we limited primarily to efficacy data? And it was interesting to first come across those concepts a few years back. It's very much kind of directed my interests in the last few years.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, super interesting. It's one of those things where I think a lot of people get stuck in the weeds, debating all the different studies about the efficacy of different training protocols and different variables like effort intensity and volume and